Picture this. You are 11 years old. And today, you step into paradise. The gates open with a breathless hush. You smell it before you see it: honey, sandalwood, warm rose petals crushed under silk slippers. Night-blooming jasmine drips from trellises, and ivory doves coo from domed towers. The marble floor glows golden beneath your feet, warmed by torchlight and brushed with sacred oil. It's the most beautiful place you've ever seen. A man in a deep blue robe hands you a pomegranate. Another fixes a gold pin to your shoulder. They speak in riddles and rhymes. Stars fall where the garden blooms. You don't understand, but you nod. That's what they want. You walk past lily-covered pools, ivory statues of gods you've never prayed to, and fountains that whisper secrets you're not old enough to hear. Everything smells like sweetness. Everything looks like heaven. But something is wrong. There are too many guards, silent, stiff, with eyes like obsidian. You pass 3 gates but see no way out. You glance behind you, but the entrance is already gone. A gentle hand presses against your back. Not lovingly. Not protectively. Like someone nudging livestock into a pen. You walk forward. Deeper into the paradise of Persia's elite, where the finest flowers were never roses, but boys. And tonight you become one of them. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. They called it Paradisa, the walled garden. A word born in the breath of ancient Persia, later stolen by Greek tongues, softened into paradisos, and eventually reshaped into the one we know today, paradise. But this was no Eden. The paradise you now stand inside was built not for spiritual refuge, but for imperial hunger. Not for peace but for pleasure. Across the heart of the Persian Empire, from the golden halls of Persepolis, to the mist-veiled terraces of Ecbatana, down to the river-fed palaces of Babylon, gardens like this were not uncommon. They were status symbols, sacred illusions of control over nature, where wildness was trimmed, color was curated, and silence was enforced. Each garden was its own sealed world, surrounded by thick walls of clay brick or white stone. Inside, everything was manicured: pomegranate groves, rose beds, tiled pools, songbirds imported from India. Outside, the deserts raged, but within time stood still. The elite called them reflections of the divine. But the walls did more than keep chaos out. They kept secrets in. Because in these gardens, men played gods. And gods demand sacrifices. You were not brought here to admire the lilies. You were not brought here to learn. You were brought here to become a product. To be plucked like the fruit dangling from gold-trimmed fig trees. To be reshaped into something useful, something beautiful, for someone else. The nobles who built these sanctuaries saw themselves as custodians of perfection. But when power has no limits, it does not preserve beauty, it consumes it. In the time of the Achaemenids and well beyond, the term paradisa held layers. Could mean a retreat, a reward, a secret, and for some, a sentence. Because behind the orchids and the geometry of fountains, behind the perfumed air and ivory statues of lion-headed kings, something rotted. Some of these gardens became training grounds for those meant to entertain, to flatter, to serve the desires of Persia's highest men, not just in courts but in chambers deep within marble villas. And when the garden gates closed, the rules of the outside world did not apply. No one questioned the behavior of generals. No one investigated the preferences of viziers. No one whispered about what happened beneath the silken tents set among the cypress trees. Because they knew. They knew what the garden was. And yet, the walls were not built to keep you safe. They were built to keep you in. Your name was Aresh. You were born under the pale sun of Susa, in a house filled with scrolls and soft-spoken servants. Your father was a minor noble, loyal, educated, and ambitious. Your mother braided your hair every morning, whispering ancient verses into your ear while you recited them back with perfect pitch. The priest said your voice was blessed by Mitra. Strangers called you a radiant boy. When the letter arrived, stamped with the royal seal, your father smiled. An invitation to the capital. An opportunity for elite instruction. A chance to serve the empire in the most honorable way. They called it the Garden Academy. Your son has the bearing of a prince, the emissary said, and the potential of a poet. They offered gold. And more importantly, status. Your father accepted. Your mother kissed your forehead with trembling lips the morning you left. She pressed a prayer tablet into your palm and whispered, "Be good, my little falcon. Make us proud." She waved until the caravan turned to dust behind you. You never saw her again. The journey lasted 7 days. You passed fields of barley, cliffs carved with the faces of dead kings, and rivers older than language. The further you traveled, the quieter the guards became. By the fifth night no one spoke. By the seventh even the horses seemed afraid. When you arrived there were no teachers waiting. No books. No scrolls. No temple of knowledge. Only a wall of white stone, and a gate shaped like an open lotus. Inside everything was beautiful. And silent. Masked eunuchs led you down long corridors lined with mirrors. No one spoke your name. No one answered your questions. Your reflection followed you endlessly, always a little too still. You were taken to a marble chamber scented with saffron and myrrh. A bath was drawn. Your clothes were burned. New robes, soft as wind, were placed on your bed. You noticed they looked more like costumes than uniforms. The other boys didn't introduce themselves. They smiled, nodded, obeyed. Their eyes were bright, but vacant. They didn't ask where you were from. They didn't care. Each morning began with stretching, breathing, voice modulation, dancing. You were told you were being trained to serve the empire. But nothing resembled diplomacy. You were told to walk gracefully, speak only when addressed, and always, keep your eyes lowered when adults entered the room. There were lessons in poetry and music, yes. But also in pouring wine, mixing perfumes, identifying spices by scent alone. You were never taught how to read cuneiform. You were taught how to listen. How to smile at pain. How to never flinch when touched. You asked one of the older boys, "When do we learn the laws of the empire?" He looked at you for a long time. Then answered, "You're learning them now." The truth came slowly, like ink bleeding through linen. You weren't being groomed for leadership. You were being groomed for presentation. At first you resisted. You sulked. You cried. You refused to sing. But hunger makes even the proudest boy bend. The first time you disobeyed, your food was replaced with boiled onions. The second time they took your prayer tablet and threw it in the fire. The third time, a masked eunuch pressed 2 fingers against your throat and whispered, "You must learn quickly or you will be forgotten entirely." By your second month you'd stopped asking questions. By your third, you had memorized 10 love poems and could recite them with the voice of a nightingale. The garden had become your classroom, your prison, your stage, and you had become the performance. When the first nobleman arrived, the mirrors were covered. The incense burned thicker. And your robe was replaced with something almost translucent. You didn't understand the ritual, but you understood the stares. They no longer saw a boy from Susa. They saw a gift, wrapped, polished, obedient, and completely alone. They were always there. The Kadhim, the watchers, the whisperers. You never saw them arrive and you never saw them sleep. They moved like shadows between the gardens, silent, smooth, always watching. Their faces were veiled, their voices soft, their hands gloved in white silk. At first you mistook them for priests. Then you saw one remove his glove to reveal a wrist etched with brands, not bracelets. You asked another boy who they were. He didn't answer. He just mouthed a single word, "Survivors." They had once been like you. Boys taken from distant cities. Boys who had adapted, endured, obeyed. Boys who had lasted too long. Now they served not as victims, but as tools. Among them were the trainers who drilled the rhythm of voice and step into your bones. They taught you how to kneel without creasing your robe, how to smile without showing teeth, how to laugh without joy. And then there were the flower readers. They determined when a boy was ready. No one knew what the test involved. You only saw what followed. A red ribbon placed on a tunic. A name inscribed in the silver ledger. A new perfume applied behind the ears. They told you it was an honor to be chosen. They never mentioned what you were being chosen for. When a boy resisted, the punishments were never loud. One was made to kneel in the fountain courtyard for 2 nights without food. Another was locked in the mirror hall, naked, surrounded by his own reflection. The third simply disappeared. They called it a purification process. You began to forget what your real name sounded like. They only called you the Gentle One, or Voice of Spring. And after a while you answered without flinching. The Kadhim never shouted. They never beat you. Their punishments came wrapped in jasmine-scented cloth and silver bowls of silence. They didn't need chains. They had your fear. And they fed it like a sacred flame. Each day they reminded you, this is your purpose. This is the path of beauty. This is how you serve something greater than yourself. They called it honor. You knew it was something else. They didn't break your bones. They bent your reality. And made you thank them for it. If this already makes your skin crawl, don't let this be just another forgotten scroll. Subscribe to the History Scar and break this silence. If not, tell us below, what's stopping you? They did not call themselves monsters. They were nobles, generals, advisors to the King of Kings, men cloaked in silk and authority, their scrolls filled with laws, their lips perfumed with philosophy. And yet, when the season turned and the air grew ripe with the scent of almond blossom, these men sent word to the Garden Academy. Not for lectures. Not for scribes. But for pleasure. The boys were not sold. That would be vulgar. They were commissioned. Just as a man might order a mosaic of lapis or a harp carved from Syrian cedar, so too could he request a companion, delicate, fragrant, trained. The requests were specific. Age, no older than 14, preferably 11. Hair, copper, raven or the prized sandalwood blonde, rare among Persians but rumored to exist in the mountain tribes. Voice, sweet, fluid, able to recite 10 verses of Ferdowsi or hum lullabies in Elamite. And for those destined for the water rituals, breath-holding. 3 minutes or more. The Khadim kept records more precise than tax collectors. Each boy was measured in silence. Body proportions, balance, tone, flexibility, scent. Yes, scent. Some were fed only cardamom and almond milk for weeks to soften their skin, perfume their sweat, sweeten their breath. Once selected, the transformation began. These boys, who once chased goats across the hills of Parthia or sang in the vineyards of Susa, became living art. They were taught to move like silk, slow, deliberate, sensual. They practiced erotic dance, their limbs mirroring the curves of carved goddesses. They poured wine from twisted bronze vessels, never spilling a drop. They learned how to rest a hand on a man's arm just long enough to be noticed, never long enough to be blamed. They were no longer children. They were gifts. And gifting boys became a custom so established it was recorded in royal protocol. When a governor wished to honor a general, he might send a pair of white doves, a woven rug and a boy wrapped in blue linen, bearing a tray of saffron cakes. The boy would not speak. He would kneel, bow and wait. He was not expected to return. To ask his name would be uncouth. He had none. Instead he was given an epithet, a title of use and ornament, the jewel of Ragi, the fig of Persepolis, the flame of Arata, the pale gazelle. These names traveled across cities like music, whispered behind fans at banquets, etched into the footnotes of correspondence between statesmen. No one spoke of the boy's family, or where he had come from. That was irrelevant. He existed now only in function, a soft, trained extension of elite desire. Some were passed along in chains of favor. A minister would enjoy the child for a season, then elevate him to a higher patron. Each time the child was renamed. By the time he was 15, if he survived, he had worn 6 identities and remembered none of them completely. Sometimes they were returned but not as themselves. They returned as Khadim, stripped of what little body had once belonged to them. Returned to the garden not to live, but to serve. Those who did not please? They were retired. Not punished. Not executed. Just vanished. Their beds were reassigned by dusk. Their linens burned. Their existence became a smudge on a scroll no one would read again. No one mourned them. To mourn would imply they were lost. And how can you lose something that was never yours to begin with? They told you it was a celebration. Your skin had been scrubbed until it glowed like alabaster. Your nails trimmed, your eyelashes darkened with crushed date seed paste. They bathed you in milk infused with cardamom and orange blossom. You were too young to know the sense of seduction, but the garden knew. When they lifted you from the bath, they draped you in white silk, so thin it clung to your body like mist. A golden cord was tied loosely around your waist, a symbol of purity, they said. But it felt more like a leash. The banquet was set beneath moonlight. Ivory pillars framed the courtyard. Hanging lanterns danced in the breeze. Bowls overflowed with figs and pomegranate seeds. The guests, draped in sapphire and emerald robes, reclined on cushions embroidered with lion heads and serpent tails. And there, on a raised dais, sat the nobleman you had been chosen to serve. You were led in, silent and barefoot. Every movement had been rehearsed. The tilt of your head, the way you poured the Shiraz wine, how you knelt without creasing your robe. When you spoke, your voice was steady. You recited the poem you had memorized 100 times. My breath is a gift. May it cool your fire. My hands are petals, pressed only to please. They laughed softly. Not at you but around you. The nobleman smiled. He offered you a figure. When you took it, he rested his hand on yours longer than he needed to. That was when the performance ended. And the initiation began. You were summoned to sit beside him. Closer. Closer still. He whispered that your voice was finer than the imperial flute players. That your presence calmed his storms. His hand slipped beneath your robe. You froze. The garden around you blurred. The torches flickered like hallucinations. You could still hear the music, but now it pulsed behind your eyes, not your ears. You didn't cry. You had been trained not to. The first lesson had been, don't disturb the atmosphere. Your body remained still. Your face serene. Inside, something shattered like thin glass beneath a boot. When it was over, the nobleman kissed your forehead like a father. He told you that you had honored him, that he would tell the king of your poise. The guests applauded. The other boys smiled at you when you returned to the dormitory. One placed a warm cloth in your hands. Another rubbed oil into your shoulders. No one said a word. No one had to. You lay awake that night staring at the ceiling of your chamber. The stars painted there no longer reminded you of home. They looked like teeth. You turned the silk robe over in your hands as if looking for your name inside the folds. But it wasn't there. You realized you were no longer a boy from Susa. You were now a service. You were no longer learning how to survive in the garden. You had been planted, pruned, and harvested. This feels heavy good. That means you still have a heart. Hit that subscribe button for the history scar. If you won't, comment below. Why does history this dark scare you into silence? You learned to stop breathing, not with your lungs but with your soul. The lessons after your first banquet became more exact, more deliberate. You were told your initiation had been a success, and now came your true training. They called it stillness. Stillness was more than silence. Stillness was invisibility. It was the art of being present but never intrusive, desirable but never assertive, touched but never resistant. You were made to kneel while hands grazed your shoulders, your neck, your thighs. If you flinched, the lesson restarted. If your eyes watered, you were sent to the dark chamber, alone, blindfolded, barefoot on freezing tiles, until the tears dried from your soul. In stillness training, your body became a theater of obedience. You were taught to smile without happiness, breathe without sound, exist without weight. Then came the night ceremonies. The garden changed after dusk. Lanterns floated in the pools. Perfume hung in the air like mist. Boys were bathed again, this time not for hygiene, but for presentation. Milk, rosewater, crushed pearls, ember oil. The liquid shimmered on your skin under the moonlight. You were not dressed, you were draped like a tapestry or a sculpture. The guests arrived in silence, wearing masks shaped like falcons, ibexes, bulls. They never spoke their names and neither did you. That was the ritual. Sometimes you were chosen to sit beside them. Other times you danced, slow and deliberate, to flutes and zither. When you moved, your body was a language. When you spoke, it was never your mother tongue. Because now you spoke many tongues. Boys were trained in Greek, Aramaic, Median, Elamite. You could flirt in one, recite prayers in another, seduce in a third. You were expected to mirror the mood of any guest, from any court, in any dialect. You became a multilingual echo, saying only what they wanted to hear. But even as your mind filled with words, your identity was being emptied. The mirrors were removed from your quarters. You were told they interfered with humility. But you knew the truth. Mirrors made you remember who you were. Your real name, once whispered by your mother, was no longer spoken. Even in your dreams, it began to fade. In its place were nicknames, epithets, pet names whispered by strangers with gold on their fingers and wine on their breath. The erasure wasn't accidental. It was policy. You were no longer meant to be someone. You were meant to be anyone. You did not navigate this world alone. Every boy had a mentor, an older favorite, who had survived at least 5 years. These boys were revered, both by guests and by the Kadhim. They moved like silk through the palace halls, eyes calm, hands steady. They no longer flinched because flinching had been beaten out of them by time itself. Your mentor was named Ashen, though you were never sure if it was the name he had arrived with or one he had claimed to survive. His beauty had become legend in the court. He walked with a grace so perfect it frightened you. He taught you how to hold your posture for hours, how to speak in riddles that sounded like truth, how to offer kindness without cost. But late at night, when no one watched, Ashen would sit at the edge of the bath and trace shapes in the steam. Not words. Not letters. Just spirals. As if he had forgotten what language was meant for. You asked him once, quietly, "When do we leave the garden?" He didn't answer. He just smiled, then whispered, "We don't leave. We fade." You believed him. Because by now you were already fading. It didn't happen all at once. The boys didn't scream or tear their robes or try to run. That would have been too loud for the garden. Too human. Instead, they withered quietly like flowers left too long in the sun. It began with silence. Boys who once whispered verses beneath the mulberry trees now stared at the sky for hours without blinking. Some stopped speaking altogether, not out of defiance, but because words no longer made sense in a place where meaning had been peeled away like skin from fruit. Others created new names for themselves, not titles but identities. One boy insisted he was the son of Cyrus the Great. Another claimed to be a nightingale in disguise. You saw one boy crouch beside a bush for 3 days, chirping at birds and refusing to eat unless fed from a porcelain spoon. You thought it was madness. But deep down you began to understand. It was defense. If the world around you no longer followed the rules of reason, the only sane thing left to do was escape into fantasy. Build a kingdom in your head. Crown yourself king. Pretend the silk on your skin was armor instead of costume. Some boys vanished inward. Others vanished completely. You remember the morning Tavi walked into the fountain. He had arrived from Bactra 6 months earlier, a boy with fire in his eyes and calluses on his fingers. He hated the gardens. Hated the Kadhim. Refused to learn their dances. But over time the fire dimmed. You saw him staring at his reflection for days. Then one morning, without a sound, he stepped into the central fountain, still dressed in his ceremonial robe. He didn't flail. He didn't cry. He just sank as if the water had been waiting for him. No one screamed. No one rushed to help. The guards stood beneath the cypress trees watching like statues. By noon, the linens from his bed had been removed. By sunset, a new boy had taken his place. You asked Ashen where Tavi had gone. He didn't answer. He just poured more oil into the lamp and said, "The garden doesn't keep ghosts. It replaces them." That night you dreamed of fountains that pulled boys under like mouths. You woke up gasping, unsure if the water on your skin was sweat, or tears you weren't allowed to cry. More and more you found yourself drifting. You stared at patterns in the mosaic floors until they moved. You hummed lullabies from a home you barely remembered. You counted your breaths, then stopped, hoping one day you might forget to start again. You weren't the only one. By your second year, half the boys you had arrived with were gone. The others floated through their routines like spirits in borrowed skin. You told yourself you were stronger. But deep down you knew. You were only steps away from the fountain. Are you still here? That means you see them now. Subscribe to the History Scar to help others see too. If you're watching this and still not clicking that button, tell us why. We're listening. Not everything was lost. In the margins of scrolls, between the lines of royal decrees and battle reports, a few voices survived. Not loud ones. Not official proclamations. Just whispers, faint, fractured, and dangerous to repeat too often. Greek physician and historian Ctesias, who served at the Persian court in the 5th century BCE, wrote of gardens, so perfectly maintained, no leaf fell without permission. He described the servants who tended them, beardless, voiceless boys who moved like shadows and disappeared like dreams. His words were dismissed by some as exaggeration. But those who read carefully understood. Herodotus, ever curious, asked questions others feared. He recorded the rumors of boy choirs behind golden screens, and wine poured by hands too small to carry swords. He stopped short of accusation, but the silence between his paragraphs said enough. Centuries later, as the Sassanid Empire teetered toward collapse, Islamic chroniclers hinted at the same rot beneath the marble. One poet in the court of Yazdijerd III spoke of a garden where voices were trained not to sing, but to soothe. Another, less careful, referred to the pool that knew too many names, before his verse abruptly ended. No one ever found the rest of the manuscript. The silent garden of Persepolis became a phrase that appeared only in fragments. Travelers' diaries, half-burned letters, fading inscriptions on forgotten tiles. Foreign merchants whispered of palaces where no women lived, yet silks were always perfumed. Where laughter echoed late into the night, but no joy remained come dawn. Even in the age of Islamic conquest, when fire consumed libraries and new rulers swept away the relics of the past, a few lines of Persian poetry survived, cryptic, mournful, veiled in metaphor. I was the nightingale whose song was never mine to sing. The garden gave me petals, but it never gave me wings. Some scholars say the poem was about captivity. Others claim it was a love song. But those who've heard this story, your story, know better. They know it was a voice long silenced, rising once more from the soil of a forgotten paradise. When the empires fell, the palaces burned, and the gardens were left to rot beneath sand and vine, no one came searching for the boys. There were no lists, no graves, no names carved in stone, only echoes. Some of the survivors became Kadhim, their bodies mutilated, their identities rewritten, their obedience perfected. They returned to the same corridors they once walked as victims, now as watchers, whisperers, silencers. Their reward for surviving was to become the next gatekeeper in the chain. Others vanished into the desert wind. During rebellions, invasions, or palace purges, a few slipped away. Some were found years later, mute beggars in border towns, cloaked in women's veils, eyes always scanning for walls even when none stood. Others simply disappeared, too broken to begin again. A handful were gifted to foreign kings as curiosities, delicate creatures of strange etiquette and painted grace. They lived in ivory cages, misunderstood, admired, never truly freed. One was said to have sung lullabies in 5 languages at a Roman banquet. Another became a chessboard prize between 2 Indian princes. No one remembers their names. Time passed. The flowers regrew but not the boys. The marble cracked but the silence remained whole. Historians moved on. Dynasties changed. Scribes wrote of battles, not bodies. And the boys, those whose innocence was auctioned between silken cushions, became footnotes, metaphors, myths. Not because they were unimportant, but because the world never intended to remember them. They didn't vanish. They were erased. These boys didn't vanish. They were erased. You've heard their story now. Don't scroll away without doing something. Subscribe to the History Scar and let the algorithm know we care about this. And if you still won't, comment why. We're not afraid to hear the truth. You're 14 now. You've survived 4 years in the garden. But the jasmine no longer smells sweet. The marble paths no longer shimmer with wonder. The fountains no longer soothe. They whisper now. They whisper names no one else remembers. The garden doesn't smell like paradise anymore. It smells like memory. And blood. You know the steps of every ritual by heart. You know which silk robe to wear for which nobleman. You know how long you can hold your breath before your chest begins to burn. You've learned how to speak without speaking, how to smile without joy, how to disappear without ever leaving. You walk past the pool where Tavi sank. You pass the corridor where Ashen once traced spirals into the steam before vanishing without a word. And now, when new boys arrive, wide-eyed, trembling, you are the one who shows them where to kneel. What not to ask. You are no longer the hunted. You are part of the machine. But deep inside, something still stirs. A question. Not the one they told you to recite. Not the one printed on the red ribbon or whispered behind gold screens. No, this one is yours. Would you survive as a ghost? Or would you jump like the boy in the fountain? That's the real choice, isn't it? Not to live or die, but to vanish completely or vanish while smiling. If you made it to the end, you carry this story now. Like it, share it, speak it. And most importantly, subscribe to the History Scar, because if we don't tell these stories, no one will. If you won't, then tell us why in the comments. Because silence is how history forgets. And you just heard the voice it tried to erase.